Welcome back, guys. If you are just joining us, this is INX Prime Live. Remember, we are on your screens every single Monday to Friday between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. Now, as South Africa marks the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the National Shelter Movement of South Africa says that this year they are demanding that the systematic failures in prevention and justice be fixed. Now, the second quarter crime statistics show femicide is on the increase and women are a lot more at risk to violent crime. Now, the National Shelter Movement says during the course of its work, they are actually confronted by harrowing stories of survivors who have endured violence at the hands of intimate partners. And we want to actually find out, is the anti-GBV legislation working to solve this issue, and where should government's focus actually be? Now, my guest is the executive head at the National Shelter Movement of South Africa, that is Dr. Zubeda Dangor. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for joining us tonight here on INX Prime Live.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure chatting to you, and thank you so much for your time again. I want to get into this conversation. Now, for those who don't know, could you please give us some background into the work you do as the National Shelter Movement of South Africa?
Sure. So the National Shelter Movement of South Africa was established in 2008. It's a non-government, non-profit organization and serves as an umbrella body for 101 shelters across South Africa. So the vision of the organization is a society where women and children are free and safe from gender-based violence. It's the united voice on sheltering of women survivors of gender-based violence and including their children. So basically what we do is we engage in advocacy and lobbying work. So we advocate for reforms, we advocate for policy changes, we advocate for additional funding for gender-based violence, because currently government only provides 40 or 41% of the funding to shelters in the country. We establish provincial networks in each province of the country. What we also do is that we do a whole range of capacity building. So for example, last year, we ran 16 different capacity building sessions for all the shelters across the country. And that came from a questionnaire that we did with the shelters, requesting them to tell us what their burning needs were. What is it that they felt they needed to learn? We also engage in legislation, so we generally would comment on the kind of legislation that's coming up from government on a regular and ongoing basis. We conduct research, and most of this research has been published, and the research is particularly on gender-based violence and sheltering. We also partner with people like the Heinrich Böll Foundation on conducting research. We then do a series of monthly webinars on gender-based violence and femicide. We also run a national shelter indaba or conference, and this is done in conjunction with the National Department of Social Development. We then also represent the National Shelter Movement on the global network of women's shelters. And here we have a clear indication of what's happening across the world in terms of sheltering and how they are supported or not supported by the governments. And then finally, during the time of COVID, we served as an emergency response because shelters were closing down. We managed to raise funds to keep shelters open, because even though COVID existed, shelters could not shut down. Violence against women didn't stop during that time. So in a nutshell, what shelters do is that they support services for gender-based violence, the survivors and their families. They serve as transitional or second stage housing, some of them do. They offer psychosocial services, economic empowerment for women, children's protection programs. We also do readiness and preparation for works, advocacy and lobbying, as I've said before. And some shelters also do food parcel distribution where appropriate. And then, of course, we help women with their ID and documentation and also their health care. So you can see that what shelters do is quite a variety of services that we offer. It's not just an overnight accommodation. Basically, you make sure that women's lives are safe. Because, in South Africa, we have the highest rate of femicide one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. So, and currently, the research is indicating that the murder of women has increased.
True. I just want to touch on something else as well. And I mean, just looking at what you guys stand for in terms of the SMSA. Now, this year, you guys have come out to say that the focus for this year must be to deal with the root causes of this violence. Can you perhaps, elaborate further on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the big things that we found is that as far as femicide is concerned, that's the killing of women. We know that in South Africa, 3 women are murdered every day by their intimate partners or their husbands. And we don't have a national integrated strategy on femicide. And so the National Shelter Movement supports this and supports the establishment of this strategy as has been as has been suggested by the Portfolio Committee on Social Development. The other thing that we do is that the Public Protector has issued a report this year. And in that report, they've indicated that there are very few shelters across the country. Shelters need to be increased right across South Africa. They also have found that there have been a lot of administrative glitches in the court system. So basically, justice doesn't get served adequately. So these are things that we are looking to kind of ensure that we can help survivors to be able to attain justice. This year in Johannesburg, there was a woman whose partner murdered her. She had come home, he was not home, and she went to her neighbor and friend and stayed over. The consequence was that when the husband came home, he found out that she was at the home of her neighbor and friend. He set both women alight. One woman spent a week in hospital and lost her life. The other one lost her life after 2 weeks. And this left her families devastated. Both have children, both have families. And these are the kind of things that we really, as a society, need to avert.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt, Doctor. I just want to touch on another very disturbing stat as well. I mean, we're looking at the stat, and I am looking at it right in front of me right now. In the last 20 years, more than 10,000 women have actually been murdered by their own, by killers in particular. But these killers are actually people that are most likely intimate or close to them, and those people are still roaming free out in the country. I wanted to know, what's your opinion when it comes to our criminal justice system right now? Do you think there needs to be a lot done in terms of that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's completely unacceptable and totally outrageous that these men are still walking the streets free. And this number has increased this year from what it was previously. So they're not, the justice system has not been able to identify most of them. And the consequence is that they can go ahead and continue to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Now, I just want to touch on something else as well. I mean, we know that the government has this national strategic plan as well when it comes to gender-based violence, and this was actually released, in 2020 as well. Do you think that the government is meeting their mandate, or is there still a lot for them to also do in this case?
So I think that South Africa is very good at establishing policies. We're not so good when it comes to implementing those policies. So we have a wonderful national strategic plan. However, the implementation of that plan leaves much to be desired. We don't actually have enough funding to ensure that that plan can be implemented sufficiently across the country.
No, that's very, very true. I just want to touch on on the issues that comes with what you just mentioned now, right? Like you did highlight a lot of these issues in particular, but we also have to highlight the lack of funding of shelters catering for women who have actually survived gender-based violence at the hands of their intimate partners. Now, I think that plays such an important role. Is there any indication that funding will actually improve? Will the government set aside a bigger budget for stuff like this?
So this is what we advocate for all the time. However, what has happened is this year, Gauteng in particular has had the worst of the funding crisis. In fact, many shelters in Gauteng closed down because government didn't actually support them. And a lot of this is related to issues that government have, their own issues. Sometimes they talk about a lack of shelters compliance, but they don't actually support shelters in maintaining or developing that kind of compliance. So shelters are actually struggling. And this kind of funding needs to come through. We continue to advocate for it. We're not 100% what's going to happen because of the past 2 years, people have really been battling. And, previously, overseas funders would fund shelters in the country. However, most overseas funders tend to say South Africa is now a medium-level economy, and shelters for gender-based violence are basically essential services. So the result of that is government should actually be funding shelters. But the problem is that even when they do fund shelters, the 60% of the funding still has to be raised by the shelters themselves.
And we hope that definitely changes. I think policy has to change, but we definitely need to have higher budgets in place to ensure that shelters are well looked after, and we also see more of them in the country as well. But Doctor, thank you so much for joining us tonight on INX Prime Live.
Thank you very much for having us.
It's a pleasure, guys. That is Dr. Zubeda Dangor, who is actually the executive head at the National Shelter Movement of South Africa, just telling us about the important stats out there, where we do know that femicide has been actually increasing and gender-based violence is still an issue, but we do know that the work that they do plays such an important role and has such a great impact on society, and we hope to see a lot more of that in the future. But guys, on that note, we are going to take a quick ad break and we'll come right back.